Robert Litvak. I direct International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, another in our ongoing series on terrorism and homeland security issues, a series that the Center co-chairs with Georgetown University's Center for Peace and Security Studies. The co-chair of the series is Professor Bruce Hoffman, and he will introduce our speaker today and tee up the topic. Today's meeting is the last of this academic year. We'll pick up again in September for the autumn series, so look out for an invitation sometime around Labor Day for the September kickoff meeting, and we'll have, as we have in the past, a full set of meetings in the autumn. But with that, I just would like to welcome Karen Greenberg to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and let me turn the floor over to Bruce Hoffman, who will introduce her and say a few words about today's topic.
I'll reiterate the welcome and thank you all for coming today, and indeed throughout the past academic year to these seminars. Once again, we have someone that really doesn't need much of an introduction. Karen Greenberg is director of the New York University Center for Law and Security, has been a pioneering figure for the past 7 years in the fields of counterterrorism, but also human rights and issues involved with both law and torture. She is the editor of the Torture Papers, one of the first analyses of the phenomena that we've seen in the post-9/11 security environment, and most recently the author of the book The Least Worst Place, The First 100 Days of Guantanamo, which I should hasten to add is for sale outside. I'm sure you can persuade the author to inscribe copies of it. But we're really delighted to have Karen. I don't think there's anyone better who could finish out our year, so thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Rob. And thank you for coming. So I thought I would just begin by talking about why I wrote this book, and then talk about what I wrote. And I'll try to do it quickly because I'm interested in your questions. There are actually two reasons that come to mind why I wrote this book. The first is that there's a lot of talk about, about was this a systematic torture policy? Was it a policy? Was it a few bad apples here and there? Was it maybe the CIA, maybe the military, something disjointed? Was it people taking an initiative on their own? And the answer to the question has, a lot of people who have done research have said yes, yes, yes. But the way they've gone about answering the question is to focus on Washington, and to focus on the Pentagon, and to focus on the executive, Bush et al., Cheney, Addington. And basically to say these guys had evil intentions, and there you have it. They wrote it on paper, and now we know this came from the top, and it was a policy. It seems to me, or it seemed to me it might be fun and certainly interesting to understand what happened on the ground. And if you really want to know if the ground and the people at the implementation level had a policy to implement, and if they knew what they were doing, then it seemed to me just an equally valid part of the story was those people. So I started to interview people who had worked at Guantanamo Bay when the first detainees arrived. I had no idea what I was going to find. I just wanted to hear their side of the story. And the most interesting thing I learned was that nobody then or now, until I did, or after, ever asked them a question. As one person said to me about 3/4 of the way through my research, and about my 10th interview with him, he said, "Do you know how odd it is that nobody's ever tried to talk to us?" And I'm talking about the commanding generals of the operation, the commander of the naval base that was Guantanamo Bay before he had the detention facility, the head of intelligence, the head of the detention effort. Nobody ever asked them a question, and to this day, nobody's ever asked them a question. So part of it became an archivist type of role for me, which was just to collect as many interviews as I could to see what had happened. And the most interesting thing was that I found a story I didn't know existed. And so that is the second thing that got me to write the book, with not just perspective, but what these people told me, all different levels, people who didn't agree with each other about the detainees necessarily, and the detainees themselves. And they told me the same story. And what's most interesting about the story is that it wasn't the story that we've come to identify with Guantanamo Bay detention facility, which is probably not a story that I need to go over because it's in the paper almost every day. So long story short, and then I'll tell you some of the details of it, this first group of 1,700 men and women, troops that received the first 300 detainees, did so in a manner that followed the Geneva Conventions, that considered them prisoners of war in a non-legal sense, and that did their best in rather rotten circumstances, namely open air cages without any kind of plumbing or electricity, to move towards a more humane environment and to treat the detainees with some kind of not leniency, because they believed they were the worst of the worst in the very early days, but with some kind of decency. For these men and women, there was no conflict between treating people decently and considering them their enemy. And the book is about, there's like two parallel tracks in the book. One follows Washington, which you have to do to understand the context and what's happening in Washington in terms of developing policy on detention interrogation. And the other one is to follow the people on the ground who are receiving some of these policies or some of the suggestions or some of the only spoken but not written guidelines from above. And so what I tried to do was to put these two stories together and to watch where Washington came in conflict with this group on the ground and what happened. And you kind of know what happens. I mean, you know the end of the story. The end of the story is this first group gets pulled out precipitously, and everything they have established is erased almost actually immediately. It's almost brilliantly done. And so that's what the book is about. So I thought I would just kind of summarize some of the things that I learned. The first thing is that when the commanding general of Guantanamo Bay is announced and is told that he's going to be the general, he kind of had a very bad feeling that it would be him. He's given 96 hours to build Guantanamo Bay, which is fast. And when they talk about closing it, I'm like, damn, it took 96 hours to open it. I bet we could, speed up this closing, whatever, time clock. He says, okay, tell me what I'm supposed to do. And they say, oh, well, that's kind of the little wrench. We don't have a policy yet. And these guys are coming. They're in the air. They're always in the air for those first 96 hours. They're always in the air. They don't know when they're going to land for security reasons or just who knows what reasons. And the general, whose name is Michael Leonard, looks at him and he says, well, what do you mean we don't have a policy? Now, the military, I don't think I need to explain this to people in this room, but the military functions on training and policy and rules and order. It does not function well on, I'm sorry, we've removed a policy, but we'll call you in 3 weeks and we'll tell you what it is. Or it could be 6 weeks, And by the way, these are the worst guys you're ever going to have, but do what you can. But this group it was a joint task force, so it was all parts of the military, but mostly Marines. Their answer wasn't going to be, okay, we're not going to do it. Their answer was, okay, well, we'll figure out our own policy. And what they did was they took the lawyers at Southern Command, which oversaw Guantanamo Bay, and their own lawyers at Camp Lejeune, which is a Marine base that most of this initial cadre came from. And they made a few phone calls, and they tried to figure out legally what they could do, given the circumstances they knew they were going to encounter at Guantanamo Bay. And they made these elaborate charts. We can do this, we can't do that. They weren't talking about interrogation, by the way, the things you're seeing now. They were talking about literally what kinds of shackles are we going to use, what shape is our detention facilities going to be, what kind of food do we have to offer, and how does this affect our troops? Because under the Geneva Conventions, those you detain and those who are the detainers are supposed to live in the same conditions. And there was zero chance that our military was going to live in open-air cages without plumbing or electricity or and subject to animals and things like that. So they actually could not figure out what the legal parameters of a non-policy was. And they also started to get a sense in this 96 hours that policy wasn't going to be coming quickly, that there was some tension in Washington that was not going to be resolved. And so they decided among themselves they would follow the Geneva Conventions. Well, the first thing you do or one of the first things you do if you are the U.S. military and you adhere to the Geneva Conventions and you are having prisoners who you detain, who you are told aren't prisoners, but they seem like prisoners to them, the first thing you do is you call in the Red Cross, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. So the general passed a request up through Southern Command with the support of the lawyers and the commanders at Southern Command and said, we would like to call the Red Cross in to help us. We actually don't know what we're doing. We're not in the business of detention. If anybody is, it's the Army. We're not Army heavy. We have no idea who these people are. We've called CENTCOM and we've asked them how they categorized them when they had them in Afghanistan, and they said to us, beats us. We have no clue. We never had a legal category for them. So we need the ICRC here. And the Joint Chiefs and the Pentagon people, the Pentagon got together and the message came back, no chance. This is not happening. The one thing you need to understand about this mission, you may not have a policy, but we're here to tell you we are not following Geneva Conventions. That's not what we're doing. We're not going to violate them necessarily, but we're not going to follow them. It's not the law. So forget it. And we're certainly not doing this, which would be an indication of our willingness to follow the Geneva Conventions. So now you have a group not only without policy, but with a negative policy. Whatever policy you thought you might have, this law does not pertain. And so they went on like this for a couple of days, still no detainees. And then one Cuban-born JAG at Southern Command, who was on a good footing with the legal team at the Joint Chiefs, and who had, and this is one of the interesting things I didn't put in the book, but I should have, who had a tie to a dissident past in Cuba, meaning that his grandfather was one of those, if you have like 5 dissidents that you honor from the days of, the dissident period, he was tied to that family. And so for him, there were certain familial legends that I think he probably wanted to live up to. And so one day he just picked up the phone and he called Geneva. And he said, hey, I bet you heard that we have some detainees. They're about to arrive here, and they're bad. They're the Taliban, they're Al-Qaeda, and we think they're bad, and we have no idea. We're Southern Command. Our arena is the Caribbean. What we know is drugs. What we speak is Spanish. We don't know anything about these people. We could use you not as a sort of, we don't want to do anything nefarious. We need you here to help us. And they said, you can imagine how, well, I know how the ICRC responded, and they said, we're there. So this same JAG then picks up the phone and he calls the Joint Chiefs and his friend, the Joint Chiefs, his parallel there, and he says, I just want you to know that I've called the ICRC and they're coming. And, her response was, your history. You are this. You cannot believe you did that. So they tried everything they could to say, can we bring them to Miami instead, and they can work with Southcom? Can we bring them to Washington? And they were like, no, they're coming to Guantanamo Bay. As soon as they got there, you had a situation of tension, dissent, and a military that wanted to hold the line and had eyes and ears to the ground that can help them hold the line. And it was a good thing, because the ICRC arrives roughly a week after the first detainees. If I could describe for you what happened when the detainees arrive, they come, they are anything but what the military troops on the ground expected. They are, first of all, my size. They are small. They are also somewhat dehydrated and malnutrition because they've been in captivity, some of them for 3 months. They are expected that they'll speak Arabic. I don't know why that was expected. They didn't, except there wasn't anyone on the ground that could speak Pashto or Urdu. So they knew right away that what they expected and what they got, at least on the very outer surfaces, wasn't the same. Nor did they know that they were going to have people arrive with sensory deprivation. And so they knew there was just so much they weren't being told, which immediately, puts a wrench in the works. The second pushback that occurs on the ground follows on the heels of the ICRC request, which is that the general in charge asks for a Muslim chaplain. Now, we all know the story of the Muslim chaplain that got in trouble later on, Chaplain Yi. this Muslim chaplain, Bangladeshi-born, is called again in the middle of the night, like everybody else seems to be, pulled in, immediately, still after the detainees, and he becomes the commanding general's way of establishing a rapport, a conversation with the detainees, because the commanding team decides they want to know who these guys are. They want to talk to them. And the word has come down via the chain of command. You are not to talk to them. There is to be complete silence. They're not to talk to each other, and you are not to talk to them. And that's it. We'll send interrogators down from a variety of alphabet agencies, but there's no talking going on in this camp. Except General in Charge didn't see it that way. And what he and the Muslim chaplain did, they established a very unusual friendship. In fact, I wanted to write a book called The General and the Chaplain, although I didn't think that, my policy friends would, appreciate that. But I thought it might go off the deep end a little bit. But they established this very unusual friendship. Chaplain was the only one, really, who had the general's ear 24/7. They had their own, phone communication system. They shared an office. There was this chaplain could walk into the general's quarters anytime he wanted, both his office and his private quarters, and they talked about the detainees as individuals. This is the single, from the point of view of the Pentagon, the single worst mistake they could have made as detaining authority. To treat these detainees in the following way: what's bothering you? What do you need? What can we do to make it better? Who are you? Where do you come from? I mean, this is the last thing in the world they wanted. And so just to get you into the head of why, so it's not like just some kind of evildoers in Washington. There was a method to their non-madness. There was a method to their way of thinking, and it went like this. These people are responsible for 9/11. They know the people that are responsible for 9/11. They can do terrible things at Guantanamo Bay, even in these confines, and they believed it. I mean, you have General Myers, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying they are bound and goggled, and they have earmuffs on, and they are tied to the floor in every way, and they are not allowed to move on this flight. And you have him saying at a press conference, these guys are going to gnaw through the hydraulic lines of the plane and bring the plane down. So there was a sense from the very beginning that these people had a kind of superhuman powers. And if you read the intelligence reports from Guantanamo Bay and talk to the intelligence officers, one of the things you learn is that they believe that every movement these guys make in the cages is a form of an act of terrorism. So, for example, they believed that there was a system, which there could have been, by the way. They believed there was a system of tapping that was about taking over the camp. They believed that there was a system of communication that had to do with moving things around in the dirt, because, and they concocted these incredible theories about what these guys who were in cages bound and were about to do to them. So there was this sense from the very beginning that the powers of the detainees defied what they saw. So there was sort of a cognitive dissidence there that went away slowly over time, in part because of the ICRC and because of the Muslim chaplain. And the third way in which the command team arranged for pushback was the press. The press has been an ever-present force at Guantanamo Bay since day one. That wasn't the plan originally, but they were sent down to Guantanamo to take a tour for a day or two on January 9th. Lo and behold, on January 10th, the commanding team is told, the detainees are coming, get the press out of there. Get them off the island. Now, you'd think maybe they would have coordinated this ahead of time, but who cares? So the press says, no, we're not leaving. And mostly everybody credits Bob Franken from CNN with this. He says, you know what, you're going to have to hurt me physically to get me on that plane. I am not leaving. This is the story of a lifetime. I am not leaving. So they make an agreement with the press. They pick one of each kind, one radio person, one newspaper reporter, one photographer, one of each category, and they allow them to stay, and they ship the rest. And they put them on a hill to the side of where the landing strip is designated for, and they let them. They have a photographer, but they don't allow pictures of the landing. They allow writing. And it's what's wonderful is how the press responds to this. They say, this was the best chance we were going to have a lifetime to prove that our words mattered. Because we've always had pictures. Now that all of a sudden it was like, wow, you can't rely on pictures. You have to do it all in words. And so they kind of get into the challenge of it. The general learns how to use the press to ask the questions he wants the American public and the policy world to hear. And he does it very deftly. And I think it comes out better in the book than I've ever been able to arrange it. But he finds one person in particular who's like the moral conscience of the base and of the press corps. And he lets her questions lead his press conferences. And so in these ways, he creates an environment in which questions about the right and wrong at Guantanamo are present from day one. When his pushback is perceived, the then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, is, to say the least, beginning with the ICRC being called in, unhappy. And he decides, and actually this is a pattern for much of what happens in the War on Terror, not just at Guantanamo. He decides the best way to handle this is not to try to get Mike Leonard, who he's trying, General Leonard, to pull out. He's trying to get him to interrogate, and he finally realizes there's no way to convert this general. And so what he does is he picks his own guy and his own team from the NSA, reservist judge from Erie, Pennsylvania, and he establishes him there with his own team. It's a much smaller team. It's a couple hundred people, but even though he's a reservist, he's a higher rank than Michael Leonard, and he reports to Rumsfeld. He's supposed to report up the chain of command, which he may do in his own way by his daily phone calls, but he at least has a split command. And he lets everyone know it. What he tells people is he works for the president. And then, by the way, he also works for Rumsfeld. And he establishes his own rules. And in this period of time, the last 6 weeks of these 100 days, he makes it clear that something new is coming to Guantanamo, and it's not going to be run by the rules of detention. It's going to be run by the rules of interrogation. And what is a moderately tolerable circumstance becomes an intolerable circumstance, and the detainees feel it, and they react. They get what's going on. There's a kind of instability and tension in the air, and they, feeling that maybe the forces that are less kind and less decent may be winning, freak out. And this is when they have their first hunger strike. And you know about all the other hunger strikes, but this hunger strike, this first hunger strike, which has not been written about, is fascinating because for Mike Leonard and the people who wanted to follow the Geneva Conventions, the hunger strike is a threat to their philosophy. The hunger strike is proof to Donald Rumsfeld and to others who agree with him that being kind and humane fails. That ultimately, if you give them an inch, they're going to ask for a mile. And so now, what have you found? Now, look at the trouble we're in. You treated them like human beings. They think they're human beings, and now they're on a hunger strike, and the whole world is watching, and this is your fault. And so he recognizes that it's a threat to everything he believes in, and he begins to take each detainee one by one and basically say, you tell me what I need to do to end this hunger strike. So it's sort of a expansion of his philosophy to a point of almost ridiculousness. And he satisfies each one of these detainees one by one to end this hunger strike. And after that, you can imagine his days at Guantanamo were over. And immediately, within days, as the hunger strike comes to an end, he's pulled out. They call a man who was running a graveyard in Rhode Island, who was a reservist military policeman, a one-star, and they ask him to come down to Guantanamo to take over from the detention general, which is what Mike Leonard has essentially become. And he is basically ignored when he is there. The interrogation commander takes over. What's interesting about this are a number of things. One, splitting a command is not how you think of military protocol. Unity of effort, unity of command, being on the same page, operating through a chain of command was all broken immediately by having these two combatant commands on the ground. But the other interesting thing about it is Abu Ghraib. You remember at Abu Ghraib that this is exactly what happened. You had a detention effort and you had an interrogation effort, and they were in conflict with one another, and what it tells you is that it was deliberate. They learned at Guantanamo that if you split a command, you can cause the trouble you need to cause to create the instability and to feed what has become our kind of rather infamous interrogation effort at Abu Ghraib. Once Mike Leonard is pulled out, Guantanamo descends into relative chaos, and it's intentional. There is, and it's not just during the day, it's also at night. There's just a kind of a free-for-all atmosphere that ensues, and led by Michael Dunleavy. And that is a good condition for interrogating people and for an interrogation regime. And over the course of the summer, the torture memos, as you know and have seen, are written. The standards of interrogation change. And the people at Guantanamo can do what they need to do to get information from those they need to get information from. The only problem is that the first team at Guantanamo realized over time that a good majority, at least 2/3 in their estimation, at least of the intelligence officers' estimation, of the people there didn't have any intelligence value. They might have been, guys with bad intentions. They might have been, not exactly somebody you want to have to your dinner table, and not peace-loving young men, but they didn't have information. They were sort of losers and bystanders and people in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the idea of interrogating them to this initial group was sort of like, okay, we can interrogate them, but what are we going to ask them? The information they had arrived with was nil. To this day, I'll tell you, we don't even know who some of the people at Guantanamo are to this day. What would happen is they'd come and the pocket litter would be all in one big sack, but it wouldn't be separated out for detainee, and it wouldn't be very much, and so they'd be sitting there. So they had to build their own files on the detainees, which is why sort of the tapping and the moving and the signals become important, because they're trying to figure out a network among the detainees. And then my final thing that I will end with, just because I forgot to say it before, is that in this sort of disillusionment on the part of the troops that are on the ground with what they've been handed, they realize it so fast that they don't even know they've realized it. So, for example, among that very first cadre, within the first 2-3 flights, they had one person who was over 90, one person who was over 80, and one person who had been diagnosed as a schizophrenic in Afghanistan. And don't forget, they have their buddies over in Afghanistan. They call them on the phone and like, what? Why are you sending us these guys? Like, we're supposed to, we believe in this. This is a real detention effort, and it's important, and what's wrong with you? And they would say to them, look, we're just trying to get these guys out of here. And but they knew, and it cracked the confidence of the military to be treated without a policy, in a policy void, told that there was no law that applied, pushed to be outside of that law, and then given people that did not comport with the dangerous people that they expected, that they wanted, that they felt patriotic about. And so that's the whole book. I think the rest it just sort of devolves into what became our detention policy there, which, by the way, lasted for a long time, and some of it still lasts today. So is that good? Do you want to ask me some questions?
That sounds great.
Okay.
There are lots of questions. Thank you very much.
We have microphones in the back that'll be passed to you. Just state your name and affiliation, please. Anyone like to lead off? In the front.
Hi, my name is Mary McCarthy. I'm an attorney here in D.C. I'm currently working at the Department of Treasury. Karen, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the ICRC in that first 100 days, and whether or not the ICRC did any kind of family notifications. And we know that I think it was later on that the list of the detainees was leaked out of Guantanamo, but I wondered if you would enlarge on that a bit. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. They immediately contacted a number. First, they got their names, and yes, they were. They enabled them to write letters to their families, and so that's when we first began to get a real list, because the names did not match up with the names that the military had. And as you know, the detainees to this day still have numbers. So they're not, they never, because that was part of the, de-individualizing, which we do in our prisons. I mean, not having their names. Of course, I should add that the military also didn't use their names. They took off their whatever. So it was all people without names, which is not a healthy environment, I don't think. The ICRC, I think, was helpful in three ways: medically, religiously, and in terms of the diet. Not beyond contacting the families. A lot of the detainees were sick and couldn't handle the food they were. Now, it wasn't just that they needed halal food. It was that they couldn't handle the diet. And the ICRC comes with doctors, and they could diagnose some of the diseases and could also set some of the dietary regime straighter. And it's sort of one of the more ironic and unpleasant parts of the story is that the ICRC enables the Guantanamo task force to set up a kind of a regime in which there's decent food, at least they have the right kind of, and they can digest it and support themselves with it, in which their diseases are diagnosed. So there's a skin disease that a lot of them had that none of the medical authorities knew what it was, but the ICRC knew what it was. And so they were able to cure those things, but then they became like, look how great we're treating the detainees, even though they don't have lawyers, even though they don't have rights, et cetera, et cetera. Religiously, the ICRC was very important because the ICRC could say, look, this is what the ritual of washing is about. This is why nudity cannot, you can't have female guards escorting detainees to the showers, and why you can't have female medical attendants attending to them. Now, what's interesting is that the military, the JTF 160, the first military unit, they agreed with the shower policy. But when it came to the medical policy, they worked with the ICRC, and they kept the women medical attendants were allowed to attend to men, which, and one of the reasons is that, and the ICRC respected this, was that the theory behind which the JTF 160 hid, and I don't want to say hid, but shielded itself, was professionalism. We're professionally military. You were telling us not to be unprofessional, and we're not going to do that. And so they would divide decisions like that. If they could find a professional reason to do something, they would stick to it. And the ICRC gave that veneer of professionalism to a lot of decisions. Another thing the ICRC did was they spoke the languages. They knew all these languages, all these dialects. And so actually they were able to, it wasn't just not wanting to communicate with the detainees, it was an they couldn't do it. They had these cue cards, that say like sit down, stand up, whatever. And, but, reading the Quran and speaking Arabic are two very different things. Religiously, they explain the difference between South Asian Muslims and other Muslims, who use prayer beads, who use prayer, kind of introduce that part of the element. In terms of the interrogation and information, I have to be very careful how I answer that question. In terms of information, I would like to say the ICRC worked constructively to help the U.S. authorities have the information they needed. One thing that's very important is that their relationship with Mike Leonard was fabulous. Some of the emails that they sent during and after about who he was and why they could work with him disappear when the next regime comes in. And so and the ICRC is there less often. And so their ability to do what they were there to do changes when this 100 days is over. It's not, and they'll, if they would talk, would probably tell you the same thing. So.
Any additional questions or comments? Or yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Rose Levide. I work with a government consulting firm here, and I'm a retired military officer. My question has to do with the pattern of assignment of military personnel to Guantanamo and how that affected the execution of the policy. To this day, for example, I just ran into a young man who just did 6 months down there as a reservist, and so the the continual rotations and how that affects policy and its the implementation of policy. I'm interested in that. Thank you.
Actually, that's a great question, and something I've wanted to ask the military about. I was like, how could you do, what were you thinking? Because, okay, the first thing that happens in terms of who's running the place, not just who's sent there, is that Pete Pace, who you all know, when he went to the Joint Chiefs, Pete Pace was taken out of the command of Southcom, and no one really replaced him. So the whole time that Guantanamo's going on and people are being deployed and decisions being made, there's a two-star at Southcom who knows he's in way over his head, and every single military person I talk to is like, well, we're going to talk to him. He was a two-star. He had no authority. So you have the authority taken out of. So then when it comes to appointing people, it's a whole other kind of thing. In terms of the rotation, I want to mention about the rotation because this is something I am not enough of a military expert to understand. I can tell you one thing. At Guantanamo, it has been the greatest tool of the administration. The reason nobody ever heard of these 100 days, think about it. You have fantastic journalists following this constantly, whether the New York Times or the Washington Post. They were astonished by this story. Why? Because the genius of removing everybody and just putting in new people, and then you tell those new people what it is that's going on. You tell them whatever you want to tell them. Now Guantanamo is an interrogation. This is who's here. If you go back through the press or you read the books, they will always say the first commanders at Guantanamo were the two people that replaced this first command. They never acknowledge it. It was just wiped away immediately, and it was the rotation that allowed them to do it. But to this day, it's a problem. When I went to Guantanamo 2 years ago, I wanted to see X-ray, which was overgrown. X-ray is where the first detainees were housed, this notorious X-ray. And what's great about seeing it now is that it's all overgrown, which is what it was when they first got there. X-ray had existed before during the Haitian and Cuban migrant crisis, and they had a detention facility there for Haitians who disrupted violently when they found out they were going back to Haiti, basically. And so when I went to see it, there's this public affairs officer with you, and he's got this big notebook, and you're walking through, and he says, well, this is Bravo block, and this is this, and this is that. And he had everything wrong. It's like, what? I hadn't sat and looked at a map of Guantanamo with every single general and every single colonel and every single lieutenant colonel who'd ever been through there. So this is a toilet that we had to abandon construction for because it pointed to Mecca. There were a lot of things that were just, and it was just the oddest experience, and I didn't know what to say. It was like it made you sick. And so I kind of waited till the very end, and I picked something very, very minor, like that's where the doctors were. Something very, like, who could that offend? But because it wasn't their fault. This is what they were told. This is what they knew. There was no, as a historian, it's so offensive to know that history can be erased so readily and so easily. And so the rotation has everything to do with it. But the theory of rotation, as I understand it, is that it allows for a kind of resourcefulness among the military that that you wouldn't otherwise, that you need. And in fact, the early Guantanamo, it was just by luck that some people actually had any clue what they were doing there. They happened to have had they had happened to have been commissioned, somewhere for 3 months, in Jordan or Egypt, whatever, Kuwait, and so there were some people who knew some things. But this is the other side of the theory of rotation. That's a very good question. Anyway, yeah.
Hello, I'm actually English and non-affiliated. I'd just like to ask you if you observed any noteworthy after effects in terms of the staff particularly the ordinary ranking staff as compared to what we hear of battlefield trauma and post-traumatic effect.
No, I think with these guys, a lot of them went to Kuwait right afterwards and were involved in Iraq. So they have other traumatizing experiences that would have built on this one. I think this group is just frustrated. You know, they feel like, you know, they tried their best and they were defeated, and forever, Guantanamo will be a stain on them. And I think that's their biggest, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's not going to change. It just can't. It can't change, and it won't change. One thing I just want to say, because I didn't say it before, but the most amazing part of doing the research was interviewing detainees. Because I actually figured, I mean, I was just collecting these interviews. It didn't occur to me, I actually didn't quite believe the story. That's actually, you know, like when you're following a story, you think, oh yeah, really, I'm sure these guys were great. You know, they had these detainees. They tell me how much they hated them. They tell me how much they don't like the Muslim religion. They're very honest about what they thought. You know, so I'm thinking, I don't know, something about this picture doesn't seem right to me. There was a lot of anger. I know there were people pulled out because of their behavior, et cetera, by Leonard. So I thought, well, I'll go talk to the detainees, and then I won't write this book. I'll write a different book because that'll. I was terrified because I wanted to tell this story. It seemed like a good story. So I went and met with a bunch of them, and I asked them to tell me the story of the hunger strike. I figured they would have a different. And they told me, not only did they tell me the same story, they told me details that no military person would tell me, because you think a military person is going to tell you this? Yes, this detainee, he hadn't seen his wife. She was pregnant, and he didn't know if she'd had the baby or not, and he wanted to know. So I called her, and I asked her in front of him, did you have your baby? With the chaplain translating. And she said yes. And so there's this whole scene in the camp, which the detainees told me, which is, you know, this call coming out from this military person, it's a boy, you know. And so just imagine this, you know, I mean, this is not, so when and then the other story, and it's come out not just when I interviewed them, but since then there's a number of books that have come out written by detainees, mostly in the European context. And they tell the story about, there's this one night that Leonard realizes, forget it, he is totally losing this battle. And by the way, when he loses, the detainees are losing, which he takes really very seriously. And he hates when I tell this story. By the way, he hates this story. But so what? You know, that's like his problem. So he goes, no, that's how I feel. So he goes, what he and Saif ul-Islam, the Muslim chaplain, did often was they would go in the middle of the night because there was a worry about abuse. So they would just show up at any time, and they thought that was a way to keep people, you know, on their toes. And during the hunger strike, he starts to be there constantly, and he's just completely frustrated, and he can't get this last group of detainees to give up their hunger strike, which is why he's gotten this fatwa from this American imam, as if any detainee would respect an American imam. You have to know, but whatever. Fatwas seem to work for some of them, and he goes to he goes to this one detainee, and he sits down on the ground, and he takes his hat off, which the detainees interpret as, okay, I'm going to talk to you sort of person to person. I'm not pulling rank on you. I'm just talking to you. But what transpires in the conversation is that the general starts to cry. Now, if you think he told me the story, you're out of your mind. And do you think I ever told him I heard this story, you're also out of your mind. But he never disputed it once it came out. And a number of detainees have written about it and talked about it because it so alerted them to the fact that, yes, this was a bad situation, but that everybody recognized it was a bad situation, and that something, you know, had to be done to move it forward. So, and the other interesting thing about the detainees and doing the research, things that you just hear that you can't believe. So the first two times you hear them, you just push them out of your mind because you can't, you can't absorb them. It seems more minor, but I don't think it is. And I think given our present state in the world, the United States, I think it's interesting. At one point during this 100 days, the guards, not the commanding staff, the guards realize that they are somewhere between 18 and 22 for the most part, that they are kids who were looking for a purpose, who were interested in the military because it gave them something to do, who were trying to behave, and some of them were kids who hadn't behaved so well, either in school or had been involved in violent things, and really just wanted to turn their life the right way. And they get to know the detainees because Mike Leonard has this "you can talk" policy, and they realize, not beginning with the Muslims, beginning with the non-Muslim detainees, they realize that they are incarcerating a group of guys who are between the ages of 18 and 22, who couldn't really find their way, many of whom had done things, that anybody in their right mind probably wouldn't have done, but had found a cause to identify with. And even though there were tremendous differences about how they went about it, they recognized that you had sort of two youth groups sort of responsible to and for and by one another. And it comes out all the time. And these are not like the most articulate people you've ever talked to in the world, but this they're articulate about. And they get it. And they'll say in the same breath, I hated these guys. But I hated these guys, and these guys were not nice guys, and they said they were going to kill me and my wife and children when they got out. But it didn't deter them from understanding that there was some sort of commonality here. And just so you know, the detainees, who I would never have told that story to and didn't, I just listened to them, said the same thing. It was like, these guys are just like us. They're like, so it's not an exact parallel, but it's interesting about how human beings in a self-contained place discover things about who they are and what they're doing. So that was another kind of interesting thing.
Lars Hansen. I'm also a retired military officer and also working with the federal government as a consultant. I'm just curious. We've had only occasionally that we've heard from Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG Corps personnel. I'm curious if you had any sense of what the effect was of this whole sequence of events at Guantanamo, both on the JAG Corps personnel who were assigned at the time, the legal people that the general consulted with, and also if you got any sense of what the JAG Corps officers' response was in general on for the following groups.
It would be really good if somebody would write about the JAG Corps and detention in general. So here's what happened at Guantanamo, and basically, this is not going to be nice, but what happened is this. The people who had direct responsibility for the detainees did what they had to do, which was answer the memos that the Pentagon asked them to answer, draft the memos that the Pentagon asked them to draft, the most famous being Diane Beaver's memo. I interviewed Diane. I think, her story is she was put in an impossible situation and then blamed for what everybody else did up the chain of command. But the chain of command, JAGs, and the generals that advised and supported them completely dropped the ball. So, for example, just to give you a sense of how this plays out over the summer of 2002, which is after the 100 days, but when they're trying to set up this policy, which is where the lawyers come in, there's a number of very famous memos, the most famous one being the torture memo, but the Pentagon asks for legal cover for new enhanced interrogation techniques. And they ask it for the JAGs, and the JAG who's assigned to Guantanamo at the time, Diane Beaver. She writes in support of more interrogation techniques than most people would have supported. Category 1, Category 2, and fudges on Category 3. She sends it up to Southern Command. The JAGs at Southern Command take a look at it and they say, this is insane, we're going to forget it. And they just put it in the drawer. They get a phone call 3 weeks later from the lawyer, who's a civilian, at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who says, where's our memo? We need your signing off on this. And they said, well, we weren't planning on signing off on it. And they are told by William Haynes, we've already signed off on it. Everybody in Washington signed off on it. Sign off on it. And so the commanders get together, and they, with their JAG Corps, and they, with their JAGs, and their JAG team, and they say, what's legal here? And basically they're told, look, Category 1 you can sort of do, Category 2 you shouldn't do, and Category 3 is off the wall, and anyone who does it is going to land in jail. That's it. It's not going to happen. You can't have the military doing this. So the general in command, who is the new general, finally, Pete Paces, whatever, has come and he says, you know what? I don't want to deal with this. It's not my job. It's already happened elsewhere. I don't want to deal with this. And just so you know, there were a lot of people who didn't want to deal with this. The stories that are going to come out now, I believe, are the I didn't want to deal with it stories, because you have the lawyer for Colin Powell, who understood the stakes in January of 2001, saying they're going to put it in a vault. They're not going to do this stuff. I'm not going to fight this. You have people saying some version, and these are very distinguished, law-abiding people. It's like it didn't dent their consciousness that could happen. Well, the same thing happened with the commander said, I'm not going to throw my military career away on something that's already happening anyway, and that I have no control over, and they're going to do with or without me. This is a little different than, and they just passed it up to the Joint Chiefs, and a memo, I'd still like to see the memo that the Joint Chiefs wrote to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which we still haven't seen. So the JAG Corps dropped the ball, but I would say more the generals who are responsible for listening to the JAGs are the ones that dropped the ball. And then Alberto Moro, the General Counsel for the Navy, and by December, but you know what, by December it's very late, and already everything had been done and the ball was rolling. So so that's some answer to a story that still needs to be written. So that's what I think.
I just wanted to ask the question that you told me before we started invariably comes up when you give this talk, which is to sort of discuss what's going on now, and the events that you've described, brilliantly in your book. It's the story of how a trajectory was set, and we've been on that trajectory, and now it's had the consequences that we've read about, and we have a new administration which is making changes, and maybe even change we can believe in. But just extrapolate from from what you wrote about to where we are now, and how are there policy tensions that this administration is grappling with, which go back to the core rules of detention versus rules of interrogation that they're still grappling with, or the decision to shut down the facility, etc.
How ironic is it that you create a group of people that are not prisoners of, that you say are not prisoners of war, and then they're treated as if they are prisoners of war intentionally, and then the reason you can't send them home is because they weren't treated as prisoners of war after that. So, in other words, creating a new category of people that Obama wants to do, that can be detained without trial, this is just my opinion, that can be detained without trial because he thinks they're dangerous, and they may be dangerous, is a precedent that is what the Bush administration tried to do. It's what they succeeded in doing, and if that legacy holds, they will have succeeded in changing our way of thinking about the world, and the first 100 days won't matter at all. So that's the number one thing. Second, it all starts with the fact that they didn't have the right guys. And I want to add, they probably didn't let the right guys out either. Because, you're now reading in the paper every day about all this recidivism, or whatever, because if they whatever. But about, how harmful these people are. It's really interesting when I interview people in the military, not necessarily the people in this book, and I say, well, what do you think about returning these people? Let's just take them back to what do you think? And they'll say, Karen, point of capture. Take them back to the point of capture. We can handle them. We're not talking about that many people to go home in this way. Most people would be repatriated, transferred, released, whatever, as have 600 of them already. So another part of this, which isn't in the book, is that the big story about closing Guantanamo is a story of diplomacy. It has been a diplomatic emptying out. That's how most people have left, and that's going to be the case going forward. And so these are very important negotiations that have to go on with countries, and they're not easy. Another thing about the detention issue that's come up is, can we put detainees in the United States in our jails because somehow either our military or our law enforcement doesn't know how to keep people in jail? And I'm hoping these guys that are already in Colorado don't get out, but just in case. But this goes back to the original terror of them. The most interesting thing in this book, there are a couple of scenes where, so what most people don't know about Guantanamo is it was a naval base that was closing at the time that Guantanamo was decided upon. And by closing, it means there were military families there. This is actually a real military base, you know? And when people say, well, there's Starbucks and there's McDonald's, yeah, and schools and cemeteries and post offices and places, you know, it was a real community. So they have to tell this community early on, guess who's coming here? And, you know, it'd be very interesting to see. So they have these town meetings. You know, what happens at the town meetings? Do they say, oh my God, you know, we got to get out of here and get our children out of here? I mean, that's what you'd expect reading today's headlines. But they don't say that. They think about it. They definitely think about it. But the only thing they care about, and they tell the naval commander of the base immediately, and they tell Leonard, and this is what the meetings are about, you know, 90% of the meetings are about is, do not take us away from our spouses. This is the legacy of Guantanamo Bay from the Haitian and Cuban migrant days, and we do not want to leave here, and we are staying here. And this is this is all we want from you as commander, and this is what you have to promise us. And of course, Leonard can't exactly promise it. He says, I'll do my best, and he does do his best, and they do stay. But you contrast that to what you hear today. We don't want people brought to a supermax, let alone a bunch of open cages in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was with an enemy on the other side of the line that can see every single inch of Guantanamo. I mean, and why? Because they totally trusted their spouses to protect them. It was never that these guys were going to get out. Not a chance. It's just not how they thought about what their partners were doing on this base. And so it just doesn't come up. The fear factor. Fear is not one of the things going on. And so I just think it's a great counterpart when I read all these people outside Leavenworth or around here, actually, so I hear and so, you know what I'm saying? So I think this is bad PR on the part of the Obama people. They should exert a little better leadership in this particular realm. So those are the kinds of, and I'm sure there are more, but they go on and on. I mean, and Obama hasn't figured them out yet, but he's trying with a good heart.
Steve Lagerfeld.
I'm Steve Lagerfeld. I'm at the Wilson Quarterly here. Karen, you mentioned the fear factor, and it's sort of interesting to contrast that with what you said about when the first detainees arrived there at Guantanamo and what the military people thought about them and the ideas they had about their tapping out secret messages and forming networks and so on and so forth. So I wonder what you can say about how we got from one point to the other. But also, is there anything special or interesting to say about how those ideas preceded these detainees before they got there? We can obviously fill in a lot of blanks, but is there anything else?
You know, you can think, I think you can think somebody's an enemy without being fearful. In other words, thinking you can counter them competently. Does that make sense? And I think that was kind of the mindset. It wasn't paranoia, you know, are they tapping things out? It was pressure from the Pentagon to say, you got to tell us who these guys are and what they're doing. And so all they had, as they had no information, was their daily reports. And you know, you've seen those towers, like on the book, they have the towers, so they'd have guards in the tower. Their only job was to watch. They didn't think they were going to shoot somebody escaping. They were watching and kept these elaborate logs, and then they'd meet with the head of intelligence afterwards and report what they'd seen, because they had to create something. They had to create a story. And so it was less paranoia than there must be some story here and let's find out what it was. I mean, one of the more interesting things is trying to find out who's in charge. You know, they come up with this theory that fat people are in charge. You know, because no, but it's not as dumb as it sounds. But you know, that if you went, no, but right, I mean, because the idea was that, you know, within the culture that they thought they were observing, it was right, exactly. So, but they took it to an extreme, especially as they were feeding them 10,000 calories a day. So you're like, okay, this theory is not going to hold past the first few weeks if you're going to continue to, anyway. So that was, and then what was the second part, Steve, of your question was about? I remember. You know, they arrive at Guantanamo 4 months after 9/11. There is every reason to believe that we're dealing with a dangerous crew. And And you don't think there were dangerous people they could have gotten in Afghanistan? I mean, I think a lot of this goes back to Tora Bora. You know, the loss of bin Laden et al. At Tora Bora, and who they actually expected they were going to have when they got detainees, and who they got, turned out to be very different things. But the momentum of being able to capture actually people who were Al-Qaeda Central was real. And so that's how that gap sort of, I think, happens. And I mean, it happens in Washington as well. As they're not trying to round up the wrong guys. They just lose the trail. And they don't just lose the trail. Let me say this differently, because I'm hoping someone else does this part of the story, because this is not my beat. The story is that if they really had intelligence value, they didn't go to Guantanamo, which is different than they found the wrong guys. They knew who was important, and they knew who they had. And if they found someone at Guantanamo that was important, they left Guantanamo in the middle of the night. This just wasn't a place for high-value detainees until Bush brought them there because it was convenient. We had other places, as you know, for our high-value detainees, and it wasn't going to be Guantanamo. So, so the real story here is to talk about the conversation that went on between the CIA and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's the real conversation. And it exceeds these 100 days, but I'm sure an important part of it took place at the very, very beginning when they were, look, some people proposed taking people out of the battlefield and putting them, who you think have information, tactical as well as strategic, and putting them, you know, thousands and thousands of miles away may not be your best idea. And so among the plans that was floated was taking them to Pakistan. And that's what's going to happen now. Now we're going to take the detainees, or whatever, it is what's happening now. Now we have our detainees in Afghanistan. Now we have comfortably a country called AFPAC. And so our detainees will be in AFPAC. And it's not so different than how it was started there. And I think the real answer to your question, how does what Obama is doing fit into this story, is, are we going to start all over again with Bagram or wherever? And without the right team on the ground, we know nothing about Bagram. We don't know who's there. We don't know. We're told there's 600 people. But that doesn't take into consideration all the forward operating bases that are around Afghanistan, and who we're detaining and why, and what it means. So so that's kind of answers both your questions at once, I think.
How is this different from what is done with violent sex offenders or others in this country that go through civil commitment or involuntary commitment? Not necessarily psychiatric detention, but people who are deemed to be a risk to their environment. And how is that, as someone who doesn't know legal things?
You have to present evidence against them. It's not, we think that we're having a problem with evidence. I mean, even with our broad material support category, which is why I think these guys can and should be tried, as many of them as is humanly possible. The reason they don't want to try them is that they don't want to suffer the risk of acquittal. It's that simple. So they're trying to rig a system where they can figure out how not to acquit them. But the difference is evidence. You know, testimony of people coming in and said he did X, Y, and we don't seem to have. These are people they really believe they don't have evidence, even in a very vague kind of. But Chris, you remind me of something. I just realized on the closing Guantanamo question, because the issue I didn't bring up, because it's not pertinent to the book, but it is pertinent to the idea of treating people humanely, is the rehab idea that's now these DRAD programs, which is being tied to the closing of Guantanamo, that we can take some of these people and that are in the preventive detention category and put them through these de-radicalization rehabilitation programs a la Saudi Arabia, and where a number of them are right now. And so I don't want to comment on that, but I just wanted to bring that up.
That was your question? Okay. Great. Well, look, great discussion and presentation, Karen. Thank you so much. The book is available for purchase outside at popular prices, and the author is here to inscribe them. So please join me in thanking Karen Greenberg for an excellent presentation today.